I want to welcome everybody today. We are going to be continuing with the conversation that we've been having around types of change and what kinds of information that we want to include for each type of change. We're going to start today by looking at delete and deprecation and see where we go from there. Before we start, I wanted to look at the action items from last week. We had a couple that were mostly around the idea of identifying some of the ways that change management is handled currently. I did see, Vitus, that you included the information about third-party vendors, and I thought that was an excellent conversation. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, that's on the existing change management documentation. And I had originally set it up for here, so you can ignore that one. Here's where Vitus had put in the information. So again, thank you for putting that in. That's quite good. I don't know if you want to highlight anything from that.
Not really. I think it's pretty self-explanatory.
Okay, that's great. So I will just point out that the top part sort of talks about what it is like currently. And then in the second part, Vitus highlights some of the challenges of working with RDF, which I thought it was excellent to have both those parts there.
So I saw this and it looked really useful. I was wondering, since I missed last week's meeting, whether there was anything that you wanted more input on any of these points. I was thinking I could reach out to Harvard has a group called Alma Authorities Reports Group at Harvard, which is, our acronym is ARG. And so I guess I wasn't sure where we were going with that particular section or whether that was like sort of complete as it is.
Yeah, so I would say that what we're trying to do on that document in general, the existing change management document, is just to understand how things are happening now and to take that into consideration as we develop our recommendations. So I would say, Christine, that if you read through Vitus's description and you do something that is different than that, significantly different, then maybe add in some information about what you guys do at Harvard.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
And Nancy sent me a note saying that she's not had time to do the mesh piece yet, but she did comment that when mesh does cancels, that most of the time they don't point towards anything else. But we can talk about that more when we look at deprecation stuff. And Jesse, I didn't see any documentation from you. Did I just miss it?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I gathered some information. I didn't know where you wanted it to go. I can add these things. I can say these things, present these things now, basically what I've kind of found. And then I can write it up in some way I can put it on the site, no worries. I didn't quite get that was the goal. That was my fault for not doing that. I was just trying to edit these present and or non-present people, which I think is kind of current, but maybe take a look at it, anybody, see if your name is there and or not there, if you should be. Sorry, one second, let me just update that. Do you want me to start talking about what I'm doing? What I found?
Is it something?
Or just write it up. Go ahead.
Maybe write it up first, and then we can look at it next week.
Okay, no worries. I'll do that.
That would be great.
Yep.
And then is our sort of standing agenda item. I just want to check in and see if someone has thought of some other subject that we need to be talking about in our group that we could schedule for a future meeting. And if not, we will jump into the types of change management. And so the discussion at this point is what kinds of information would we need to include in a change management document that says that something's been deleted? Sort of the short answer to me is the URI of the deleted thing. And then the question that I have is whether or not that is sufficient. And that's mostly based on some of the discussions we've already had around the fact that these entities are really a graph and not all of them, not all of the graph related to the entity is going to have the subject URI as the only beginning part of a triple. There may be other triples that start with another URI or a blank node. And so the question in my mind is it sufficient to only receive the URI of the thing that is deleted. And Dave, I guess I would wonder what your thoughts are on that, because maintaining a cache, getting something like a URI of a deleted entity, is that sufficient for you to clean up the cache?
From a payload perspective, yes, because it's basically a blob in a leucine index. But in terms of what the graph for that entails, that's where it gets super complex. Because you don't know whether or not, if you think about chains, linkage chains of triples, you don't know whether a given downstream triple is used by other components of the overall environment for that particular authority. I think for authorities, it's probably not quite as bad, but there's still potential multiple references to a given triple. And then there's the whole question of how far out do you go in terms of removing things, in terms of those chains of linkages.
So this is Kevin. I think everything Dave just said is spot on. The one thing I will add to it is maybe deleted is the wrong word. So, you know, what we've been doing at ID, or been trying to do at ID now for years and years and years and years and years, is not delete, but deprecate. And insofar as we've been able to do that, we try to point to the thing that replaced the URI, assuming there was a replacement. And there usually is in some way or another a replacement. But so we never just kind of remove, or we try not to just simply remove a resource from the system, which would trigger all the things that Dave mentioned. But we try to deprecate it, which triggers a lot of what Dave mentioned, but with a slightly different bent. Meaning that, you know, if you have something relying on the URI and it's been deprecated, is there a way to get it replaced in the right spots? I'm going to stop now, starting to feel like I'm rambling.
So the other twist on this is also that if you've got those chains of interlinked triples, if you break the chain by removing the initial triple in the chain, having those now orphaned subchains doesn't hurt anything unless you're coming in and querying by some of those other properties, and you potentially find a fragment. But if you're coming in by means of the subject URI, you can actually put up with cruft building up in the system, and then periodically effectively do a graph walk and see what triples you touch or don't touch, and discard ones you don't touch. This is kind of this is very much akin to the old 1960s, 1970s notion of databases having to go offline for cleanup, where they were deleting old records. We're sort of still in that, you know, era right now with this technology.
I have a question. Obviously, I have to say I kind of like this idea of deprecation, but I can see that because you're actually not destabilizing those links and the data changes over time. Like, I appreciate that. I really do. My other question has to do, though, with well, really the question has to do with the ratio of current to deprecated, and how that deprecated data like is being stored, and then how much data it is, and then how we deal with that accumulation. Just curious. I mean, it'll vary from context to context, but I'm just wondering how that's working.
Well, for indexing right now, it just means that the triple store is much larger in volume in terms of total number of triples than is reflected in the number of payload context blobs that are sitting in the index itself that's used for responding to an incoming authority query. So by the time you hit the Lucene index in the cache, that's only active stuff because we intentionally don't include deprecated content as we run the Sparkle queries to populate that index.
Okay.
Well, except for the one that this is the deprecated index.
Got it. So in this case, just to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying from your cache setup, then is that there is an index of deprecated data, basically.
There can be.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think your question is a good one, Jesse. I'm not sure what we can do on the change management side of things. That's definitely an implementation issue. Like
Right.
each
Right.
authority could actually approach that differently.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you so much.
The other aspect of this, it's just disk space and the cost of repopulating the triple store. There really isn't any performance impact on running a Sparkle query or probing the Lucene index. Because at least Apache Jenna is quite nimble in what it does with indexing for a given Sparkle query.
I wonder then, just from the sort of change management aspect, then, if there's a way in which just informationally that affects something, how people are thinking about information. What I mean is, I think there's a way in which metadata people are not trying to throw things away. And so then there's this sort of idea of what to do with old data. Like, so how much of it is to be kept? And I feel like there is sort of at least like an explanation that the jump to the new does not mean a ridiculously large amount of throwing away of the old in terms of changes to the graph. I'm just wondering if that is maybe just like a general idea that could be expressed in larger explanations, because we know that when we make these infrastructural changes that we are losing something and gaining something. So trying to figure out like what that sort of psychological salve is from the training perspective to move more people into, say RDF based metadata production, etc. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the other thing to think about here is there's more to the overall ecosystem than just how lean and mean a given authority's triple store and associated index is. Because if you think about it from the perspective of, I've got a system that still refers to an old deprecated subject URI, I need to be able to figure out that that is actually now deprecated. And if I have to go to the original authority to discover that, I can't figure that out within the cache environment or via QA in some way. Then I come up empty instead of being led to the right thing.
This might be slightly speculative, but I think I've definitely seen people complain, that, we used to have these paper things about updates to subject headings, and then we, chucked out the old ones when we got the new ones. So doing research in this area is kind of a pain. But the thing that I'm thinking of here is there's a lot of debate now about when you move to a new subject heading that is, say, perhaps less inflammatory or offensive, what to do with the older subject headings and in what form they should continue to live on in our systems. And I think when they can, when they can live on in a form that's explicitly deprecated, people can make deliberate decisions about when to keep them and whether to display them or just use them for indexing or whatever, because there's always some hand-wringing about, if researchers have been trained on particular searching methods, like, will we be losing them? So I'm sure somebody can articulate that better than I can, but it's definitely a thing that's mostly come up, retrospectively about current LCSH, but I could imagine it coming up in, newer technologies as well.
Yeah. Well, and Christine, this is a really nice notion if you think about it from how do you maintain the history of the authority? Well, if you never delete and you only deprecate, that chain of provenance, if you will, is present and could be rediscovered by doing the right kind of analysis.
Right. And like, I think it also like helps us, like, as you say, like it leads us to information rather than a dead end. So it's a thing that I think it aids disambiguation. Maybe it's an edge case, but it aids disambiguation, and I guess it supports the notion that things will always be in flux, because I don't think we're going to, like, choose the exact right heading to supersede an offensive heading. The language will always change. And I think we just need to embrace that instead of thinking we're going to get it right this time.
Lynette, sorry. Hi. Can I say something about how we are managing the CKB for deleted and deprecated? Because right now we declare the deprecated an entity, but if I remember correctly, I can double check with our technician. We delete physically the entity from the data set, and we maintain the information and its history in the URI registry. So I don't know if this could be an opportunity to have a second place linked to the first place, that is to the data set where a kind of history is related. This is our experience, but I can double check with our technician. And the second is a question, because we are speaking now about the case where we delete an entity or declare something deprecated. But I don't know if you already speak about this. What happened when the entity remain and I need to delete a property that can have a URI, can be identified with a URI. So the entity remain, but I update. So also in this case, I think to maintain a trace of this history, or in this case, in case of an update, I need to delete a property, I can delete, stop. I don't know if the question is clear.
I'm not sure I followed everything. So I have a question for you first on where you said the entity, you delete the entity, but the URI is marked deprecated and remains in a registry of URIs. So
Yeah.
you delete the graph that's associated with the entity that was deprecated.
Yes, I'm not sure if into the data set, into the set of graphs, we maintain a trace just to make possible a link with the URI, but the URI registry, sorry. I was asking to our technician, and probably I will answer you in the next days. But in any case, our approach is to maintain as deprecated, so not to delete physically, but maintaining this information in the URIs registry, where you can say, okay, this URI, this entity was declared deprecated in this data for this reason, if you have one, and adding something more. And the URI registry is strictly connected with the data set. So you can read it in the meantime when you use your data set.
And the other parts of the graph associated with that, is that maintained, or is that the other parts go away? It's just this registration of the URI.
Sorry, can you repeat, Lynette?
Sure. So it sounded like there was a URI registry, and in that it has information about when it was declared deprecated and why it was declared deprecated. And if it outside of this registry, originally it was a graph of multiple triples associated with that entity. Does that
Yeah.
graph outside go away and only what remains is the URI registration?
I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure. I prefer to give you an update in the next days about this, because I'm not sure about the relationship between the two, but I'm sure that we don't delete anything so that it disappear, but we maintain a trace in the URI registry. How they interact, I prefer to explain you in the next days.
Okay, and I wonder if you could ask your question again, and because I heard several questions in your second question, and I'd like to stop at the point I hear the question because I lost track of it as you went. So if you would ask your question again.
The second question?
Yes.
Yeah, the second question is, this is the topic when an entity has to be declared cancelled, deleted, or deprecated. But is also the case when an attribute is considered deprecated, or in this case, we are in the case of update of an entity, not in deletion of an entity, but just an update.
And so is your question like what kind of information that you do when it's an update instead of a delete or deprecated?
My question is, when I need to delete an attribute that is identified with the URI, for example, an occupation for an agent, an occupation is identified with a URI. So in this case, I don't delete the URI, but I just need to update the agent, and I need to say, okay, this is an attribute not still valid, so is deprecated. In this case, I need to maintain a trace, or I can delete, stop.
So it's not the entity as a whole that is no longer valid, it's a specific attribute within the graph for that entity, like occupation.
Okay.
Did I recap that correct? I just want to make sure I got your question correct.
Yeah.
So I definitely think that that is going to fall. Actually, I don't know if we have changed where anything in it could have changed, but I don't know that we taught. Are you asking that? Is there a way to identify that only a single attribute has changed? And how would that change document look like, as opposed to saying something has changed? You want to be more specific, like this thing has changed?
I have a clarification question, and I think there's some really great points being discussed here. And it just has to do with thinking about what is being deprecated. So what I mean is, let's say it's so possible that in certain contexts, the URI is actually not being changed, but the label is being changed. And so there's one context there that I think needs to be managed somehow, and there's various ways which we could add this into our thinking. And then there's sub-elements of a larger entity which actually have different types of data points within them. And that's, I think, what we're just talking about, where we have like an authority entity that is, like say a person, and that person has tons of attributes, being defined by other, like say vocabularies, okay, but they're all being brought together in the graph. So I think there's a kind of different. I want to make sure we're thinking clearly about those kinds of distinctions, and where the label. But there will definitely be contexts where the URI will actually need to be replaced. So then, how does the old and if we define the entity by the URI, and then how that sort of fits in the deprecation schedule of a larger matrix versus like a sort of smaller so-called, say, a subject matrix or a genre form matrix, in which like the question would be whether or not that is one subject or if it's multiple. So does that make sense? So I think there's like some issues there. I just trying to understand if we're going one direction or the other, or trying to take into consideration both of those contexts.
I think the short answer is that we want to make sure that we explore all these possibilities.
Okay.
Because I can't say, no, we don't care about something, or yes, we care about something, and kind of until we know and have laid out what those somethings are. So we've already kind of talked about labels, and we actually spent quite a bit of time talking about labels. And I sort of intentionally circled off of the question of labels because it has a lot of complexities to it. And with the intention that as we work through some of the other questions, we would probably circle back around to some of the complexities again. And because I think there's a lot of overlap in all these complexities, because we end up talking about graphs for deprecated. And to me, deprecated and deleted feels like it should be something super easy, because when you're talking about traditional databases, you just delete the record, or you just mark the record deprecated, and it's not challenging. But when you start talking about graphs, then you used to have to talk about the edges of the graph and what was actually deprecated. And so I did add in there, and I think, Tatiana, that this covers what you were talking about, and you can correct me if that's not correct. Is, can a part of the graph be deprecated instead of the entire entity? And then I gave you the examples of the label, and I gave the example of a single attribute like an occupation. And then I also gave the example of it's a link to another entity, like an agent.
Exactly, because many people can search for something and find, for example, a relationship between two agents, and after this relationship is deleted because, okay, this is a mistake. So how we can, or the question is important to maintain a trace of the previous relationship, or we can, okay, this is an error, I can deprecate a part of a graph, not the whole entity. Yes, is exactly.
Yeah, and the interesting thing for me on this is that it sort of addresses some of the questions we asked about label previously, in that, we were saying, because these are triples, if you say that you're changing a label, does that mean that you're adding a label? Like in the case where there's lots of variants, you may be adding a label, or are you replacing something? And if you're replacing it, you have to say what you're replacing as well as what the new thing is. And so that seems, I guess that seems tied up in this. I don't know that it necessarily answers it, but it's like another aspect of it.
I was reading something over the weekend, and it mentioned that in the RDF abstract model, which I've never read, it says that RDF is atemporal, and basically meaning that when you publish a graph, it exists, and it will always exist. It can never disappear altogether. And so what maybe the way to think about it is, you have a graph that is true from point A to point B, and then you have a different graph that succeeds this previous graph, and it has some different information in it. It could be the whole thing, it could be something within it, but something is different, and so you have a new one, and that's the idea, that once you publish something, it is there, it will continue, it will persist, and that graph is basically a snapshot of something, of a description at a certain point in time, and it is frozen at that until it is replaced by something somewhat different.
So I don't know if I completely understand how that is the recommendation for identifying those changes. I did put in a comment that says, can deprecation be used to identify what has changed?
I think this doesn't directly address the issue of identifying what has changed, but that perhaps it can address the issue of how should you view a change, and whether the previous version is no longer useful.
Do you have a link to that where that was being described?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, if I can find it, I'll put it in the Slack channel.
That would be great.
Or do you want me to add to this document, or?
Either way, because once I see it, I can add it to the document as well. So,
Okay.
Either way.
I don't know if the text that I typed in the chat is the text that you referred to, Vitus, where it says the RDF data model is atemporal.
Yeah, I guess I'm just not, that makes sense to me. At the same time, I'm not sure. I'm always wondering, how do we identify how parts of a graph have changed? How do downstream consumers know that something should be removed from the graph or updated in the graph, since things don't go as like a whole record?
If you have a version of a graph and it consists of this set of triples, and then you have the next version, which consists of a set of triples. If you compare the two, whatever is different is the change.
So I guess what brings in the challenge for me is where are the edges of the graph? If something's missing, is it missing because the graph just wasn't expanded out quite as far in version 2 as it was in version 1? Or is it missing because it has been removed from the graph? I don't know how you distinguish between those two situations.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure either.
Hey, Kevin, I'm wondering, what have been your thoughts at LOC around parts of a graph changing?
Sorry, I had to get off mute. We have typically, to this date, taken, how do I back this up in one sentence? So we view basically all the data generated from, let's say, a MARC record, a MARC authority record. So we're talking about, if you go to id.lo.gov, and look at a subject or a name or anything else in the system, most of that information you see, we consider a graph. If we can generate, anything we can generate, say, from the source mark, we consider is the graph. All the triples that we generate from that source mark, we consider the graph. When we update the system, we effectively replace the graph each and every time. So we have, in that way, largely avoided having to deal with changes to just individual triples within a graph. Does that answer your question?
So I'm wondering, is the reason you're able to treat it sounds like almost like you're describing a blob of graph data.
Pretty much.
And that is the reason why you can think of it as replacing the whole graph, because you're not really dealing with edges and interactions between the edges of the graph that might actually come from multiple places. So,
correct.
Okay. Because I'm thinking of the instance where you have something like an agent, and so if you have part of the agent graph in your blob, but the agent is also used in others as well.
Kevin, just to clarify, when you say the graph, you mean like do you mean something like, the graph of like all genre form terms, or the graph of all LCSH terms, or do you mean something larger or smaller than that?
Smaller. So you take one term, all the triples that we can generate from a single MARC record for a single term is what I'm referring to as a graph in this situation. So when I say we replace the graph, we're replacing all of the triples that in any way relate to that one specific resource, not the entire data set.
Got it. Thanks. So in that case, if we're talking about an authority record, do you mean all of the assertions about one entity?
Correct.
So in a situation like, okay, you have a name, title, authority record. Could be, let's say it's for series. And the name has its own graph. It has its own attributes and such. And then the title part of it has its own set of attributes. But the authority record is a combination of the two things. And I'm wondering then where's the boundary? Do you still have a graph that is only the name, title, authority record?
We have a graph that is only the name, title, authority record. So a lot of our ability to do this, we benefit from the fact that all of that maintenance happens upstream of us. So, for example, an author dies and someone goes in and changes and adds a death date to the author's name. Now let's imagine that there are 10 name, title, authority records, all of which also have this author's name in them. Catalogers will go along and manually change those 10 name, title records, which is why I say we've benefited. We've been able to do this largely because the work that would otherwise be very hard to do has all been handled upstream for us.
So I think where life starts to get complicated is when you're starting from a subject URI and moving out through the graph. The moment you reference through a URI that has its own existence criteria, you start getting into the potential for duplicate references to subsequent triples. So coming back to Lynette's question about where does the graph end, anything that's sort of local in neighborhood to that subject URI, blank notes are a good example of this. Those are safe to mutate at will within that subject's neighborhood. Anything that hits something that other people, other sources are going to use as a reference point to enter the overall space should be viewed as distinct from the neighborhood of this record. You following? Because otherwise what you end up with is I've got a work and I've got a subject URI for an author, and if I include the label for that author in the local neighborhood for the work, I'm replicating that across as many different works as that author has. But if I instead think about this as anything that's functionally dependent upon the author should be in the author's neighborhood, and only the stuff that's about the work itself should be viewed as in the work's neighborhood, and that the author's subject URI is the cut point, if you will, for disconnecting those two graphs.
Yeah, in listening to you both, it strikes me that that's the downside of the blob approach for a graph, is that when you do a blob, you might include all sorts of outside things about the agent, including their label and all sorts of other information about that agent, and you stuffed it in the blob because you want to be able to deliver that all up together. But then you've replicated that agent's data, and so the agent changes outside of that blob. Now your blob is out of sync.
Yeah, and see, in the triple store, there wouldn't be any redundancy because the triple store is representing each of those things once.
Right.
It's when you pull it out of the triple store and start creating contexts that you cause the replication.
Right. But then again, this is another reason why change management is important, because if you know you have these blob representations, if you get notification that that agent is changed, you can sort of go through your blobs and update them appropriately.
I seem to remember about 2 years ago saying that blob representations for Sinopia were evil. And this is why. They ought to be editing directly on the graph, but too late.
For whatever it's worth, to riff on what you were just saying, Dave, for whatever it's worth, you know, I have this dream, it's a long time coming, with ID, where, so right now we have these very large graphs and we replace them, and they've all got a lot of embedded contextual information. So, you know, take all those name titles, you know, it's not just a URI, we actually have the name of the author. So if the source record for the author changes, the name would remain static. And so the dream I have actually is we would load all of this data, and then a post-load process would come along and take all the records that had just been loaded and pull them out and reduce them to their to as few triples as possible. So in other words, instead of having any contextual information whatsoever, if a URI could be used for an entity, a URI would be used and there would be nothing else in the record. At the same time, that same resource would be re-indexed so that the index would have contextual information, but the source record itself would only have a URI. And then from that moment on, whenever the resource were requested from the system, the URIs would be gathered from, the labels would be gathered from the other parts of the system that actually have that. But affecting all of that, putting all of that in place has been very, very hard to really do, to get up to speed on, especially with something the scale of ID.
Yeah. And, you know, this is totally equivalent to the notion of normal forms in relational database theory, where this notion of the name of an author is functionally dependent upon that author's URI, and anything that's got that kind of functional dependency, you do not embed that pair of values in another record, because you end up with redundancy and update problems, because instead of being able to reach in and correct or modify the name of the author once in the author record, that author's name is scattered across the system, has to be hunted down.
That sounds similar to an issue that we are grappling with right now, which is how to do copy cataloging in the BibFrame environment. The ideal would be that when you do copy cataloging and it involves a work, an instance, a bunch of agents, some subjects, and so on. I think ideally your copy cataloging would be just a bunch of URIs and nothing else. And when you need to, let's say, display information for this in your online catalog, you go and get the necessary data by following the URI out and get the latest version of whatever it is. But there are significant practical difficulties in doing it that way. And so I think people tend to just, well, let's go and get the data and store it ahead of time. And when you do that, then you have the whole change management issue that would follow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
this is exactly paralleling the notion of update anomalies and so forth in normal forms and databases. Now, in database systems, they have this notion of view definitions, and you can materialize views to provide efficiencies, but materialized views are just snapshots and can be refreshed. They give you the performance without abrogating the purity of the normal form version of the data.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is that most of the time the data, if it was done in a pure sense, would not even live on your system. It would live on somebody else's system. And so if you were referencing something that was out at LOC, you would just have the URI to the thing out at LOC. And if you wanted the label, you would have to dereference the URI and pull the label on demand. And if you've got 20 URIs and you're trying to do 20 dereferences and pull out specific information, and then there's questions about how much information are they going to send back, you just wanted the label, but they send you the whole thing, and it's not performant. I mean, that's the bottom line. And that's how we end up with, you know, the desire for things like caches and blobs and indexes and things like that, is we're trying to address that performance issue. We have 10 minutes left, and I'm not sure what we had, like, have we come to sort of a decision about what information we would need to provide for deleted and deprecated? I'm still not feeling solid on that, because it feels like there's the big question that keeps coming up is the edges of the graph. And
so I have a suggestion with respect to what you're contemplating right now. I was poking around a moment ago on the website, and I saw that someone had started to put together, I don't know where I found this now, example Sparkle queries of, you know, how one would go about. It's at the very bottom of existing change management approaches. Anyway, someone started putting together mock Sparkle queries about how they would go about, you know, updating a resource based on, I guess, it being modified or changing or something like that. And I wonder if going through the exercise of putting together a series of Sparkle queries, let's just use Sparkle, you know, that would explore the steps that would need to be taken in order to, you know, update a graph or update triples in a system based on the only thing knowing, for example, is the resource change.
that is an intriguing way to express the change. Do you have any documentation or anything that you could point us towards?
I don't have anything handy, but let me see if I can insert something onto this page, or we can create a new page, or something
You can always put it,
that would
you can always put it in the
demonstrate what I'm talking about. Yeah, I could do it. I'm happy to stick it into the existing page. But anyway, I could gin up a couple of Sparkle examples in a particular sequential order that I would think would help us figure out, you know, where the edges of the graphs are, where the steps that would need to be taken, where the gotchas are to a particular idea.
Yeah, and I'd be interested in other folks thinking about that across the next couple of weeks, to, you know, like what would that mean to you if that's how you got your change management document? If you got it with something like a Sparkle query that would identify what kinds of changes needed to happen, would that be reasonably easy to process or challenging to process?
I don't know if so much it would, you know, something like that would come as part of the package. It might be just about identifying common patterns of change.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And
kind
I
of
say that
equivalent
because
to,
every system, the way they save it might be different. Sorry, Dave. The way a system might save to store their information might be different, such that no generic approach will work, but the general pattern would be the same.
Yeah, well, the other thing that I was kind of thinking as you were expressing that is that it could be that you have this Sparkle query that would do the update, and you have additional information that would be in like a JSON type format that would specify what it was. And because if someone has a triple store, they might be able to just apply the Sparkle query. But if someone has it stored in a different format, then they may want to process each change individually. So I don't know what you were going to say, Dave.
I was going to say, this is basically what a diff is in a text file, is the edit commands that mutates a first version of the document to a second version of the document. This is how platforms like GitHub and SVN and so forth maintain versions of artifacts within a source code environment, is basically deltas that mutate that construct iteration through iteration. So the prospect of the update to your local cache comes in as a stream of insert, delete, add commands. And when you're done with that sequence, you're now updated. That's the minimalistic notion of how you could push a delta from one site to another. The tricky bit there is you either need a full dump or you've got to run all of the incremental changes in sequence to make sure that you've got a valid graph.
So I've got a lot of stuff under deprecated that I feel like really goes under changes in general. And I will sort of clean that up and move some of that stuff down to general, the discussion under general changes. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I think that even though we're running up against the same kind of questions over and over again, I think next time we might talk about split and merge and just keep going in this direction, because I feel like if we continue identifying what some of the overlapping patterns are, then we can swing around on a second pass and maybe start solidifying some recommendations. Because right now I feel like I have more questions than answers. And I definitely want to move us towards being able to provide examples and things that would allow someone to actually make some sense out of some of these challenges that we keep identifying. So any other thoughts folks have before today's meeting is over? All right, well, that's lots of information to sort of mull around and think about, and we'll swing back to it in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Thanks, Lynette.